Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. Hope you're well today. Horrible day here in Ireland. Hope it's not the case wherever you are living. Today we're going to be talking about individuation in Jungian depth psychology and whether this ought to be the end goal. But before this, I have two cats with me. Hopefully they will not be disturbing this video. Before this, I just wanted to share with you that I have written two books, The Infinite Castle, my new novel, and my book on the INFJ, The Ecstatic Soul, both available down below, each for less than $10. Thanks for supporting my work. You can also support me on Patreon. There's a link down below. Thank you very much to my supporters. I appreciate you. I wanted to share some reflections on individuation because among the people, the circles that explore a lot about typology. They explore different models. They explore the more Jungian models. Maybe they explore some of the models that depart from Jung to some extent. But there is this idea, right, that one of the goals of a person, insofar as they have a personality, is individuation. And individuation is understood, at least in a traditional Jungian sense, as the integration of unconscious contents in order to exploit the maximal expanse offered by your possibilities. The possibilities that constitute your personality, that are in your psyche. Your conscious self offers a certain range of possibilities. Your unconscious self offers an additional range of possibilities. Individuation consists in the integration of the two, conscious and unconscious, thereby expanding the personality, and by expanding the personality and by making it more expansive, bringing in a greater level of detail to it, and therefore individuating you in the sense that whatever relies on your persona kind of gets pushed aside and you become fully yourself. So individuation in some sense is, of course, people are individuals, by definition, but individuation is not so much that you become an individual because you already are an individual, but that you become who you truly are. I really think that Jung, was inspired partly for his concept of individuation by Nietzsche and this idea of becoming who you are. So it's about exploiting the hidden potential that's buried beneath the threshold of consciousness in your psyche. So on paper, it looks very good. Now, some people associate this with the integration of your cognitive functions. In other words, for an INFJ, having all functions at least partially integrated. Insofar as SE cannot be completely integrated, at least having it sufficiently brought above the threshold of consciousness that it would be integrated. So individuation would be not only a question of bringing the functions to consciousness, but also bringing all the contents to consciousness. In fact, it's an interesting question in itself. Is what Jung talks about when he talks about individuation the same, or is it implying that all the functions have to be integrated? Because you could also argue that individuation consists in an integration of contents and not so much of functions. But it's, I think, safe to assume that in Jung the distinction between function and content is not always very clear, and that when he talks about the shadow, for example, what we don't like about ourselves, there's also aspects of our functions that we don't like and that we repress. It is a fact that there are a lot of people who are of a certain type, but they openly talk about not valuing some of their functions and not wanting to exploit some of those functions. The question is, are they wrong to take that position? Would anyone benefit from having the maximal amount of unconscious contents, including cognitive functional content, brought above the level of consciousness? Because if you listen to this idea of the path of individuation, then you automatically assume that that's what ought to be the goal. And there's a lot of people who don't necessarily have the the conceptual resources to formulate this as a process of individuation, but still very much like the idea of being of a certain type and exploiting the full possibilities of that type in order to be the best possible version of themselves as being people of a certain type. So we'll leave aside for now the idea that your type isn't everything, and there's lots of other areas of growth that you should be focused on. When it comes to individuation itself, reading a lot of Jung, I've come to the conclusion that it should not be exaggerated how crucial individuation is. And I will go so far as to claim that individuation is actually not necessary. So that sounds pretty radical, sounds pretty strong. It goes against the current of maybe certain models that are really anchored in this idea that any individual ought to achieve the destination or the path of individuation, even if it's a lifelong process. What seems to come out of Jung's writings, and it's something that I think I agree with in large part, is that individuation is really not for everyone, because individuation is potentially dangerous. And people who have really tried to work on, any function that's not their dominant or their auxiliary might attest to it. It's not easy to bring to integration on unconscious contents. You might fail to do that. You might get extremely stressed as a result of that. You might feel very unwell as a result of that. Because on a Jungian line of analysis, someone needs to have certain faculties with regard to the consistency and the solidity of their conscious field in order to be able to integrate these unconscious contents, without either the unconscious contents slipping back into the unconscious very quickly, in which case there's no real integration that takes place, or often this happens as a result, by the way, of the unconscious contents. They come to consciousness now because they were unconscious. There's a very strong chance that they were not liked. They were not liked, they're brought to consciousness. Is the person ready to accept them? Sometimes the contents regress into unconsciousness because they're rejected, and the person tends, in Jung's words, to cling to their persona. And there's, again, in the fact that individuation is not necessary, the persona is not a bad thing either. We should not think that the persona, this mask, this social mask that we have, is something that ought to be got rid of. It actually has a very important value. Becoming an individual in the first place, being extricated from the logic of the group, starts with this intermediate stage, which is the persona, where you're still in the group, but you're starting to distinguish yourself by attributing to yourself certain characteristics. In fact, they're given you by the group. That's why it's still a social concept and why it's not complete individuation, but it's a step, and an essential step in the development of a well-functioning society with a distinction between good and evil. Because if Jung's contention is also that in primitive societies where there was very little distinction between conscious and unconscious, and the collective unconscious was kind of dominant and taken for granted, good and evil were kind of mixed up together, and you could have really which strike us nowadays as examples of admirable behavior and instances of absolute cruelty and evil. And from Jung's perspective, the fact that happened is not indicative of wild inconsistency in moral behavior on the part of primitive societies, but rather of the fact that there's no sharp boundary at that point yet between good and evil, because conscious and unconscious are not as yet completely differentiated. But in any case, a regression of those unconscious contents back into the unconscious is one possibility. Another possibility, which is more dangerous of individuation, is when the unconscious contents get integrated, but they take over. They take over the personality in such a way that the unconscious contents actually retain their autonomy. They're now in consciousness. They retain, nevertheless, their autonomy, which they had back when they were in the unconscious, because the integration doesn't completely happen. They're in consciousness, but they do what they want, and they tend to take over the piloting of the self, if you like. So that actually would get closer to certain cases of split identity, split personality, pathologies, mental illness. So again, that's another instance of where individuation is something that's not going, not necessary to pursue at all costs, because it has to be a very gradual process and a process that has to happen organically. I think that someone who were absolutely dedicated to integrating their unconscious contents and were ready to do it in as quick a fashion as possible, they're exposing themselves, at least if the Jungian account is to be taken as true, to serious risk. Serious risk because the psyche in its conscious part has to be mature enough to be able to face those contents. And the gradual fashion, those contents are unconscious for a reason. Yes, they possess great energy, and they are capable, if integrated, of giving new meaning and a new panorama to life. But it's not something that people should just play with. It's not... the unconscious is, as a lower definition, another person. To integrate that other person, it's not something that is easy to do. And it should not be fast-tracked in this sense. And again, this is linked to the fact, this is linked to this contention also, that the persona is not a bad name. Most people have personas in reality. And ultimately, if you have the choice between a fuller life, fuller meaning, more energy, but it's a disjunction, you can't have both. Either that or adaptation to reality, even if it means persona. Well, adaptation to reality is better, because then you can actually function in reality. You are not going to be the slave to neurosis, incapable of taking on work and being in relationships and so on. Adaptation to reality, concretely from the viewpoint of the individual's happiness and flourishing, is more important than individuation. Before you can start thinking of having a fuller life in terms of aesthetics, in terms of morality, in terms of possibilities, in terms of projects, which is associated with individuation, it's important first to be well adapted to reality. Someone who's not well adapted to reality in the first place and goes straight to seek to integrate unconscious content, it's probably going to make their neurosis worse. So, to not exaggerate the importance of individuation and to not denigrate the persona too much either. Those were just thoughts I wanted to share today. Maybe they will be very confusing, inchoate. Maybe I didn't articulate them as well as I would have liked to, but I was curious to share these with you. I see you guys tomorrow. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.